Okay, welcome back to Gary's Economics. Today we are going to do the fourth part of our online course about inequality and the economy, and we are going to explain why wealth inequality is a central problem. Okay, so we're back on the course again. So far we've had 3 episodes. Episode 1 was what is wealth? Episode 2 was what is wealth inequality and how does it affect the economy? And episode 3 was if inequality is so important, why don't most economists talk about it? Today we are going to explain how I came to travel from being a classically trained economist. I did my undergrad at London School of Economics and then I went to work in the city to believing that basically contrary to most mainstream economic opinion, wealth inequality is actually the central problem that we're facing right now. Okay, so I studied economics from 2005 to 2008 at London School of Economics. It's a very elite economics university. It teaches economics in the classic way. It doesn't look much at inequality. So when I started my first job outside of university, which was as a short-term interest rates trader at Citibank, I wasn't really thinking about inequality or distribution at all. I started working full-time as a trader in June of 2008, which is obviously just before the Lehman crisis. A big part of my job and the job of my team was to look at central bank base rates, central bank interest rates. So for example, in this country, the Bank of England, in the US, the Federal Reserve, and say, okay, what are they now? What are they going to be in 1 year's time, in 6 months' time, in 2 years' time? So this is kind of what you would call like a macroeconomic analysis job in a way. The central bank is supposed to control inflation. Basically, when the economy is weak, they cut the rates. When the economy is strong, when the economy is overheating from an inflation perspective, they increase the rates. So really what you're doing is you're looking at the economy. Is it going to be strong? Is it going to be weak? That was my job. That was my team's job. I started there in June 2008, which obviously is a few months before the Lehman crisis. In October 2008, the crisis sort of slowly bubbles. In October it explodes. Lehman goes under. There's this massive economic collapse. I guess some people who watch the channel now might be too young to remember that. There was a huge economic collapse. Tons and tons of people lost their jobs. It was an economic disaster, and central banks all across the world, including in the US, here in the UK, Europe, Australia, they all suddenly slashed their interest rates down to 0. This was like a really extreme measure at the time. So we're doing this video in the beginning of 2025. We had 0 interest rates quite recently. But at the time, in 2008, 0 interest rates, they were like totally new, except for in Japan, which had been happening for a while. Like before the crisis, central banks would move interest rates from like 5.5 to 5.25. It was really that kind of like delicate fine tuning. And then suddenly in 2008, you have, oh my God, this is such a disaster. They're being cut from like 5.5 to 0. Well, technically 0.5, but this kind of thing across the world, effectively from 5.5 or 4.5 down to 0 in a matter of, you know, a couple of months. Massive, massive aggressive cuts. So our job then as interest rate traders, from the perspective of predicting, is to look at the economy and say, okay, well, how long are these rates going to stay at 0 then? When are they going to come back up? How quickly will they come back up? What level will they go back up to? And at the time, because the interest rates had been cut so aggressively, and most of these traders are aware of the basic economic theory, probably worth covering what economists think here, right? So this response, which happened in 2008, basically the exact same response we had in COVID, right? Slash the interest rates, push the interest rates down. This is a very classic modern economic response, right? This is how modern economists want to manage the economy. It's all about interest rate management. If there's an economic weakness, you reduce the interest rates. And the economic theory is quite simple, right? Interest rates are lower. You're not making any money for saving. You can borrow cheaply. It's the same for businesses. There's no point saving money. You can borrow cheaply. Go out and spend. Go out and spend money. Borrow money, invest, build up your business, borrow and spend. It's free. It's super cheap to borrow. And bear in mind, right, before 2008, we would cut the rate from 5.5 to 5.25 and expect that to make like a significant difference, right? So we believed, and economists still do believe, that these small interest rate changes make a big difference to the economy. And during 2008, we had these massive changes. And the general economic consensus on that was, and still is, these stimulate the economy, but it takes a bit of time. Generally they like to say 18 months, a year and a half. It takes that sort of time for these interest rate movements to influence the economy. So when we had these massive interest rate cuts, everybody was saying like, oh my God, like this might be too much. We're going to see like a massive economic bounce back. You know, we might see a spike in inflation. People are even talking about hyperinflation. And speaking now in 2025, I think you have to point out that a lot of this narrative was quite similar to the narrative during COVID, which is when you have these massive movements in interest rates, they're so economically stimulative that we are going to see like a massive bounce back. And you know, people now might not remember the media during the 2008 crisis, but they'll probably remember media saying during COVID, we're going to have a roaring 20s, there's going to be all this pent up demand. In a lot of ways, it was quite similar. People were saying these massive moves in interest rates will cause massive economic stimulus. And basically, when you're a trader, you can just look at the markets, right? And the markets will say, we think interest rates next year will be X, right? So interest rates went down to like 0.5% here in the UK. It's pretty much the same, US, Europe. And you could say, what will they be next year? What will they be in 2 years' time? And everybody was like, well, we're going to have such a big bounce back that these interest rates are going to come massively up. I was really young, right? I was only 21. I turned 22 during the Lehman crisis. Very young, naive, inexperienced trader, fresh out of university, study economics. So you kind of accept it, right? And I was busy, you know, trying to make money in other ways.